Paris wore winter like a thin silk. A chill that slipped under doors and warmed itself on radiators painted over too many times. The sky above Montmartre held a pale promise. Neither bright nor broken. Just a softened sheet stretched over rooftops and chimneys that exhaled like tired animals. In a third-floor walk-up with a staircase that spiraled like a thought, Élodie Marchand set her palm on the wall to steady a box, and felt, through plaster and paint, the faintest impression of another hand. The apartment had been empty for months. It did not behave as if it had. She lived on work that survived in margins. Translations done in a clear, attentive hand, for people she would never meet. Words passed through her like rain through lace. Foreign, made gentle as they crossed. Boxes made an archipelago across the floorboards. Between a primer on the grammar of longing and a chipped porcelain saucer, she found a brass key taped to a folded note. The paper thinned along the creases, fibers weary as old linen. She unfolded it carefully. 4 words in a slanted script. Rue Lamarck, 1952. No name. Only a single letter at the bottom, L. Left like the tail of a comet. The key felt newer than its years. The metal warm, as if waiting had polished it. She placed it on the sill, where the light could do its work, and set about making a room into a life. Curtains skimmed to length. A chair turned toward the window. A desk beneath the chimney breast. When evening arrived with its amber thrift, the building woke to old habits. Pipes gossiped. A neighbor set down a glass too firmly. A bicycle took the stairs as if insisting on flight. From beyond the wall to her left came the faintest thread of piano. A melody tentative as a letter begun and paused. She smiled at the thought of company, then remembered the concierge's shrug earlier. The apartment next door had been sealed since the 1970s. A private storage now, for a family no longer in Paris. She turned the radio to low, pretended the piano belonged to it, and let the night practice its repetitions. Days found their pattern. She learned the trick of the front door. How to twist the key while leaning in with her shoulder. To persuade a century of wood to forgive her. She bought bread warm enough to hold between her palms, as if it were a small animal. The scent of yeast and smoke trailed her up the hill. On mornings when bells from Sacré-Cœur slipped through the fog, the city felt awake in a kind way. The apartment offered small resistances. A sash window that refused to settle. A latch cupboard that opened to reveal a spool of thread. The precise blue of old postal uniforms. A puff of plaster from behind which came a sound like a sigh rehearsing. On the 4th evening she set a cup on the table, and the table moved a finger's width, as if making room for a ghost. The cup did not spill. She said aloud that old floors have their reasons. The radio replied with static that arranged itself into the ghost of a chord. The memory of piano again. At the baseboard between her apartment and the sealed flat, the pane had cracked into hieroglyphs of heat and patience. On an impulse that felt less like curiosity and more like etiquette, Élodie slid a postcard into the thin gap, where the wood kissed the wall. The card showed the city from the steps of Sacré-Cœur. People reduced to punctuation marks. The river drawing breath across the middle distance. On the blank side she wrote in neat print, "Who are you?" She did not add her name. She let the question lie there overnight, folded in the dark like bread. In the morning the card lay on her table. Perhaps placed there. Perhaps remembering how to be on top of wood. A reply occupied the space her question had left. Written in ink that had browned towards sepia. The script patient, the scent faintly of pipe tobacco and starch. I live here too. 1952. The signature was only the letter L. Leaning rightward, a sprinter in slow motion. Silence followed the way weather follows a decision. She made tea. She held the card as one might hold a hand one is not sure one may take. She considered the concierge. The sealed door. The sound of piano rising through plaster like heat. The card carried an odor that belonged to the years after war. A chemical sigh of typewriter ribbon and iodine. Of rooms opened on spring days to push out the winter people had held in. She slid her palm along the baseboard, then pressed her ear to the wall. Faint, like music played in the next room of a dream, came a cadence of keystrokes, a rhythm too deliberate to be mice. She placed her palm flat in reply. The wall held its breath. She wrote again. "What is your name?" Days became correspondence. Notes slipped beneath wood and returned altered by the past. She learned the delicacy of leaving space in a letter for a life she could not see. L called himself Lucien. A photographer returned from something he described only as sand, and left behind light. He rented the flat in 1952 for its view of the roofline, and the way winter made the horizon honest. He described a neighbor who braided her hair, and sang a bar of piaf softly while cleaning. A baker who flirted with flour as if it were a woman. He wrote about a city mending itself in small stitches. About Sundays when bells rang in a language made of weather. She responded in her century's calm. She described the same view, now softened by double glazing, and the bright rash of electric scooters. She described the tourist wind on the Basilica steps, and the way cameras had moved into phones, homesick for pockets. She wrote about translating grief from one language to another for strangers. How sometimes the kindest translation was an edit the author would never have granted. She told him the building's concierge watered geraniums, even in months that did not deserve them. That a cat had chosen the second-floor landing as its small parliament. She asked careful questions and received careful answers. He never wrote directly about the war, but the war wrote itself into the gaps. Their world narrowed to the thickness of paper. Days arranged themselves around the baseboard's exchange. Élodie began to notice small adjustments. Her vase rotated by a degree. A book shifted closer to its neighbor. Once, a paperweight she did not own. A smooth oval of glass with a bubble caught inside like a suspended yes, sat on her desk. Beneath it lay a contact sheet of negatives. Men and women arranged in grids of captured attention. Their eyes aimed at a photographer whose hands had learned patience. She held the sheet to the window, and saw, in one small square, the building's facade. A shadow that could be Lucien himself. When she returned the sheet under the baseboard, with a note that said, "I think this belongs to you," the paperweight remained, as if it had made a personal decision. In his notes he began to describe a piano. He claimed it lived more in his memories than in the apartment. That its sound here was only his fingers recalling something they had once done well. She pressed her ear to the wall on evenings when the sky thundered quietly with trains the city no longer ran, and heard scales practiced without arrogance. Sometimes the piano sounded inside her chest, as if the ribs were strings, and the heart had learned a new key. She let the music disagree with the century, and did not insist that truth choose a decade. Objects began to cross, as if borders had become a courtesy rather than a law. Lucien wrote that a book had appeared on his table one morning, its cover smooth in a way varnish never achieved. Its title in a font he found absurd, The Grammar of Longing. He said he could not read it. Its sentences constantly replacing themselves, with different sentences as if embarrassed by their age. She laughed and felt the pressure behind her eyes at the thought of her book living in two rooms at once. In exchange, she found upon waking that her Olivetti had been replaced by a heavier model, smelling of oil and quiet pride. A machine that had served. The keys bore the scars of hands that liked to press too hard. She touched them with respect that felt like grief. The letters grew from cautious exchange into the shy weight of companionship. He wrote about light with a photographer's faith, that it could warn and forgive in the same gesture. He wrote about moments he had chosen not to capture, because taking them would make them untrue. She wrote about sentences that fought her for their order. How sometimes the kindest translation was an edit the author would never permit. They described the same rain crossing 2 different Aprils. They found language for colors the city only invented when loved enough. He described the smell of coal and peaches. She called it metal and fruit. 2 halves of the same season. She cried once reading a line about someone he had left in the sand. A sentence that never used the word love and therefore could be trusted. Time grew confused the way mirrors become confused. When 2 face each other. She glimpsed herself in the hall mirror, wearing a black dress with a waist she did not own. A strand of pearls she had never touched. Her hair arranged with someone else's discipline. The reflection persisted a breath. Then remembered itself back into the present. On his side he dreamed of streets, with glowing signs that moved. People speaking into their hands urgently. He described a cafe where no one read, and everyone stared at rectangles, as if counting something vital. He woke from the dream scornful, then embarrassed by the scorn. She learned to walk more softly. She spoke less on the telephone. She matched his days with her nights, his afternoons with her dawn. The city outside gave itself to spring's arrogance. Chestnuts blooming like rehearsals. Tourists returning with practiced all. Inside, Élodie's rooms filled with a new density, as if air had been upgraded. She lived between centuries like a hinge that had discovered another angle. One evening, when the sky bled modest pink into gray, she found a longer note under the baseboard. Paper thin as onion skin, ink pressed so cleanly it shone. He wrote that the wall between them had grown thinner, that he could feel the warmth of her hand when she leaned against it. Here, sometimes, her pen hesitating. He asked if her city had forgiven itself. He admitted his had not. He wrote that he could continue like this, to write and receive, to exchange artifacts of days, as one might continue breathing. He also wrote that sometimes the piano asked for a chord he no longer knew how to play, a chord that sounded like a door. At the bottom of the page he traced the shape of a key, long and old, the head like a clover. She placed his note beside the brass key she had found. The silhouettes matched the way strangers resemble each other from afar. The air near the baseboard cooled, then warmed, as if remembering. She slipped the key beneath the wood with a brief apology to whatever etiquette governed these exchanges. In the morning the key returned to her table heavier, the head polished by fingers that were not hers. A second note lay under it, not yet. The wall felt like breath held. She tried the key in the sealed door next door, turning carefully, ready to stop at the first resistance. The lock neither accepted nor refused. It translated her intention into a soft click that meant only later. Paris proceeded with its weather and its crepes and its complicated permissions. Élodie's translations compiled on her computer like well-behaved ghosts. The city's music changed keys by the hour. She and Lucien built a house of paper between them. They did not imagine themselves meant for rescue, only for care. On a morning that refused to choose its season, summer in the light, autumn in the wind, an envelope slid under her door. The stamp was wrong. The postmark read 1953. Inside lay a photograph printed on fiber paper the color of milk, edges scalloped like a careful wish. It showed her balcony, the same crooked geranium pot, the same ironwork curls. In the doorway stood a woman in a dress with a collar like a tide. Her head turned, her hand raised slightly, as if about to touch the frame of the world. The woman was Élodie, if Élodie had been instructed by another century. A shadow at the edge suggested a man behind the camera, holding his breath. On the back, written small, for when the wall forgets to be a wall. She placed the photograph on the mantel. It calibrated the room. In its company the ordinary became articulate. The key on the sill itched in her palm when she passed. The baseboard cooled in the afternoons as if the building needed hours to think. She dreamed that night of a staircase that climbed into its own past. Risers written on like pages, numbers untrustworthy. When she woke, the piano played a minor scale on the other side of the wall, and her throat closed pleasantly around an ache. It happened so gently that catastrophe would have been easier to name. The border began to fray. Calendars misbehaved. She reached for a sweater she did not own, and found it draped over the chair. Wool that had learned the shape of her elbows decades earlier. A receipt stuck to her shoe listed prices in francs for items she had not bought. Her phone took a photograph of the afternoon and returned it in black and white, contrast slightly off, as if remembering a developer bath. She put her hand to the wall and felt a pulse. She left a note, "The key is yours if you want it." Then another line she could not help, "But nothing is free." His reply took longer, 3 days measured in coffees, and the upstairs neighbor repeating a single phrase on the violin, until failure became beauty. The paper that slid back was thinner, as if certain years produced lighter cellulose. He wrote that the key had revealed a door she could not see, in the shared wall where paint had cracked. He said that if he turned the key on his side, the door considered itself real, and he could feel air from a room where electric outlets had mouths instead of faces. He had not turned it. He stood with its shape in his hand. A man at the lip of a river learning he'd never understood water. He didn't know if stepping through would mean leaving his year, or asking her to leave hers. He wrote that sometimes his hands shook with the desire to stop being brave alone. He wasn't reaching to change time, but to prove that loneliness could echo and still sound like love. The concierge knocked that afternoon to say the building's owner would renovate the sealed flat. Workmen would open it next week with hammers and consent. Élodie thanked her and stood in the doorway until the stairwell light timed out, and the building became a vertical series of dark promises. She returned to her room and set her hands on the table the way one sets hands on a prayer. She understood at last that time behaves when left alone, and becomes opportunistic in company. The wall hummed. Dust motes rehearsed gravity in slanting light. She wrote a letter she could barely finish. She explained the renovation, the end of their days as they had been. She wrote that the key didn't open a room, only a choice. The word choice broke in her mouth. She wrote that she could turn the key at midnight and see what the door considered true. She wouldn't do it without his sign. She placed the letter under the baseboard and felt the tug of it leaving her. The evening refused theater. It arrived like any in Paris, windows lighting one by one. A bicycle bell offered without malice. A couple arguing softly in shoes too beautiful for arguing. She set the brass key on her palm and practiced the shape it asked her hand to make. Midnight came without ceremony. She held her breath and listened at the wall for a sign. It came as a single note on the piano. Not a chord, not a melody. Only the simplest E suspended long enough to become a choice. She put the key into the crack the paint had opened like a seam. It accepted the shape and grew warm, as if metal recognized itself. She turned. Air moved. Paint remembered a door centuries older than itself. The seam widened into an outline the color of old paper. Beyond, a darker dark. She saw a coat with a collar that would itch in any season. A photograph pinned to a wall that did not exist in hers. A shadow waiting for a cue. She spoke nothing. Speech belonged to another set of rules. She understood that to step through would mean certain deaths, of small obligations, of bills and inboxes and the city that knew her by her shoes. She understood that to close the door would also be a death, one they had rehearsed through every letter. The building answered softly, then louder. A truck downshifted outside. A radiator coughed. Glass fell upstairs. The old plaster cracked in a new place. A flake fell between worlds with a sound like a word mispronounced. The door's outline trembled. She looked at the key, at the curve matching his drawing. She thought of the workman arriving with measured kindness, of his line, "I do not want to be the only witness of my days," and wondered whether she'd asked him to be hers. She placed the key gently on the floorboards at the threshold, so it lay there like a compromise no one had requested. She lifted it once to be sure, and felt the weight of her century return to her wrist. Then she slid the key across, into the older room, and withdrew her hand. The metal clicked against the table leg she could not see, and came to rest with patience she could almost hear. The door didn't close, but it began to forget itself. She stood until the shape in the other room moved. The suggestion of a man lifting a thing, not with joy or relief, but with the careful sadness of someone returned an object they can't yet use. The piano offered no note. She took a step back. The line of the door thinned to a seam. Then a crack. Then paint again, chalky under her fingertips, warm from use. The room remembered its ordinary, and wore it like a robe put back on after standing a while at the window. Noise returned on its schedule. Her clock, slow for months, decided to be punctual. The radio found a station devoted entirely to rain. She picked up the photograph of her balcony, the one with her other self, and slid it into the drawer where unmailed letters slept. She placed her forehead against the wall and felt nothing but the simple fact of wall. Her throat tightened the way a muscle does when asked to lift more than before. Morning woke her with the construction crew's apology, mediated through hammers. The sealed apartment yielded itself, boards pried, air traded. Dust bloomed and settled. The scent less romantic than in stories, more workmanlike. The concierge apologized to everyone equally. Élodie made coffee and sat on the floor, back against the baseboard, knees up as if listening to a child's secret. She held no note. She wrote no note. She let several minutes be minutes. Weeks passed. New wiring learned old walls. Fresh paint smothered the vocabulary of cracks. The rooms next door joined the present like a recovered relative. A couple moved in with plants that didn't suit the light. They arranged their chairs the way chairs suffer and forgive. Élodie nodded in the stairwell and learned their names. She wrote in the evenings, translating a memoir of a baker who survived by over-kneading bread when flour was scarce. She found in parentheses the weight of a city lifted cautiously, set back down carefully, lifted again. Sometimes late, when window plants made tidy shadows, and the city rehearsed its river of motor and breath. She set her palm flat to the baseboard, and let the quiet do its work. The wall remained a wall. The room remained her room. The key remained elsewhere. In a century reluctant to answer to hers, she told herself nothing had been taken. Something had been spared. She allowed herself to be unconvinced, and loved anyway. Spring convinced Paris to practice forgiveness and lilac. Élodie adjusted to new neighbors' sounds. A microwave's small tyranny. A laugh shaped like an exclamation point. The soft thud of a book learning to be put down. She kept the paperweight he had left. It gathered the day under it like a parenthesis. On afternoons when rain made the city honest, she'd hold the glass oval to the light, and see in its bubble the outline of an old key. On nights when wind made promises it couldn't keep, she slept by the wall because it had decided not to be anything else. If anyone asked about the smell that visited sometimes, starch, tobacco, a tired piano note, she said the building had a memory and left it there. If anyone asked whether she had been in love, she said she'd been the witness to days not her own. And it had been enough. And not enough. She worked. She ate. Some mornings she climbed the steps of Sacré-Cœur before breakfast, and let the good part of the city, self-control disguised as grace, rise to meet her. She stood at the balustrade and watched present and past fold into each other like language pairs she'd lived inside. Never perfect, always adequate, sometimes suddenly more than both. There are rooms that learn your contours, walls that accept the weight of your back, doors that never open and save you anyway, keys left on sills in other years, carried briefly, returned with metal warm. In a city that arranges memory by arrondissement, a life can unfold across time, without asking to be photographed. On a night when wind pressed the trees into prayer, she set the paperweight over a list of tasks she'd been avoiding, and let the list become a small, private history of avoidance. She turned off the lamps and waited, as she sometimes did, for nothing to happen. Nothing did. It was the kindest silence she had known. And somewhere, in a room that believes itself still 1952, and has the evidence to prove it, a man set a brass key in a shallow dish on his table, and placed beside it a note, with a single letter, and a word that can mean both farewell and promise. Some thresholds are faithful even when never crossed. Some letters arrive without addresses, and teach you how to answer without owning. If this story left a quiet with you, keep it. Sit a moment with a wall you've always ignored. Let a familiar room tell you what it remembers. And if it moved you at all, share it with someone who has stood at a door and chosen to stay, so they know that staying can also be a way of crossing.